Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to some of you. A very warm welcome to all of you joining our monthly webinar series this day and 23rd of October. Today's session is Agile Project Portfolio Management, brought to you by Okloa and Swift Kanban from Digite. Let me get started as people are joining. Let me get started with some of the agenda and housekeeping, etc. We'll start with a few introductions, and I'll introduce the main speaker to you today. Before we get on to the rest of the agenda, we'd like to get to know a little bit about you. So I have a couple of poll questions that I'd like to ask you all, so that you can tell us a little bit about your current experience with Kanban. A quick word about Digite Swift Kanban. I'll give you a quick overview and then hand over the session to our main speaker today, Patrick Stead, who will talk about Agile Portfolio Management. And then at the end, we will do a Q&A session. As always, the questions will be taken during the Q&A box that you will see on the right side of your screens. You can ask the question anytime. We will take them at the end of the session by Patrick. And yes, the webinar is being recorded, and we will share the webinar recording after we finish today's session in a follow-up email pretty shortly. So with that, let me get started with the introductions. Patrick Stead, our main speaker today, is the founder, principal coach, and trainer at Okloa Flow Labs. My name is Mahesh Singh. I'm a co-founder and senior vice president of marketing at Digite. A little bit more about Patrick. For those of you who may not know him, Patrick has been an Agile business coach with years of experience working in that area, helping teams and organizations create a deeper understanding of agility. He's the creator of the Okloa Flow Lab, and he teaches and coaches on agile thinking, and that's something that he's addressing in today's webinar as well. That before methods, you got to get into agile thinking and agile culture, and that's really what makes agile successful in organizations. And this is what he teaches through the use of business simulations, etc., in his Flow Lab exercises. He's done some pioneering work in the upstream and customer and discovery Kanban. For those of you who may not know that, he's been speaking about it in conferences for several years now, and I have been fortunate enough to have heard him speak on the topic several times. And of course, he's a regular speaker at a variety of international conferences, including the Lean Kanban conferences that are organized by the Lean Kanban University. He's, of course, the 2015 Brickell Key Award winner as well for an outstanding contribution to the Kanban community. So before I get to the rest of the presentation, let's go ahead and show you a couple of poll questions, and if you could please respond to those, we'll get an idea of who are the people today in today's webinar. So let's go ahead and bring up the first poll question. All right, so the first question that we wanted to really get an understanding of was, are you using upstream Kanban for better demand management in your teams? And of course, many of you probably have learned about this for quite some time, and may be using it. So I'd like to know whether you're using it or not really yet, but you need to understand it better, or currently you have no plans for that. So let's see. Give you a couple of seconds here to respond to this question. I see that many have already voted. To give you a couple of more seconds here, and all right. So let's go ahead and show the results. Okay, so Patrick, good news for you is that 30% of people on the audience today are already using upstream Kanban, and there is a 60% opportunity or 70% opportunity that there is need for people to understand it or get to learn a little bit more about it to decide whether they want to use it or not. Let's go ahead and get to the second question as well, and this is regarding portfolio Kanban, and let's understand from you again, what is your experience with portfolio Kanban? So the question is, how important do you consider Kanban to be a part of your organization's portfolio management strategy? And I'd like to know if it is something that you're considering or are currently doing already, or you're using traditional portfolio management practices and tools, just to get a sense of where portfolio Kanban stands as far as your portfolio management is concerned in the organization. Okay, again, give you a few more seconds. And all right, let's just go ahead and get the answers in. Okay, so Nearly 90% of you are considering it to be important and evaluating it actively. It's a great opportunity again for all of us to learn from today's webinar. And some of you are already using it as part of your portfolio management practices, so it's critical to you. And some of you are happy with the traditional portfolio management, but hopefully you will learn something from today's session and might even be encouraged to consider it or explore it. Great. So with that, let's go ahead and close out the poll, and let's continue with the webinar slides. I'm going to just give you a quick introduction to Digite Swift Kanban for those of you who may not know too much about us. So we are a software company. We have been in the Bay Area in California since 2002. We've been around for quite some time. We have over 750,000 users around the world using our products. And our products cover Lean Kanban, Agile ALM, Project Portfolio Management. And of course, Swift Kanban is our flagship Lean Kanban product. It's used a lot by software development, IT, DevOps, which is sort of the typical footprint of usage of Kanban in many organizations. However, there is a number of organizations that use us outside of IT and software as well. A little bit about our portfolio management capability. We provide a fair bit of capability around running and modeling portfolios, building hierarchies of work that naturally occur in your workplaces, providing your risk management capability and being able to decide based on what risk you have, which initiatives to take up and so on. And a lot of capability around understanding your demand, your capability and your capacity planning, etc., using the enterprise services planning module that we provide, which has been in play for a number of years by now. We provide a lot of capability around that. Like I mentioned, Swift Kanban also is used, probably about 20% of our customers use it for marketing, HR, procurement, and legal, etc. So if you are seeing users of Kanban outside of IT and software, there is a fair bit of experience that we have in that space as well. One of the best things that we also see is a lot of usage of personal Kanban, where people use us for their own personal work management or household chores and a variety of different things. So we have a lot of usage there as well. One of the things that we are quite well liked for is the extensive sort of coverage we provide to all of the key Kanban analytics and metrics, including things like flow efficiency, blocker analysis, cycle time analysis, and so forth, and a variety of others that are there in the system. So I encourage those of you who might not have yet taken a look at Swift Kanban, if you are interested, to go ahead and do that on our website at digite.com. Just a quick look at some of our key customers. We have hundreds of customers around the world with users spread around the world, and certainly a lot of validation from some very well-known brands around the world. All right, so with that, let me go ahead and hand over the session to Patrick. Patrick, a very warm welcome to you. Thank you for doing this webinar with us, and as always, we always enjoy hearing you and listening to your ideas, and looking forward to this one as well.
Thank you, Mahesh. Thanks for this nice introduction. I had a slide with my an introduction of myself, but that was nicely covered by you, and it's always a pleasure for me to work with you guys and to be invited to one of your webinars. So one note first. If you hear a little bit of a strange noises from my side once in a while, don't be surprised. I have a little bit of a cold, so once in a while you might hear a sniff or something. So the topic of today is Agile portfolio management. So this grew out of our work with upstream Kanban, and then also it grew out of our work with Okalawa FlowLab and how upstream Kanban merges into Okalawa FlowLab. So thinking about how we can develop not just simulations with Okalawa FlowLab that play out at the team level, but actually simulations that play out at the portfolio level. So that's a little bit of the background of this presentation. So why portfolio management? I think essentially because it's really a cornerstone of business agility. You can think of business agility as reaching all kinds of functions in the organization and being able to have a broad coverage of Agile in the organization. So that's one way of thinking. But another way of thinking is really agility at all levels in the organization, also at the highest level. So I think the importance of the portfolio cannot be it cannot be underestimated or should not be underestimated. So it's really important. It also plays a key role in many of the scaled Agile frameworks for scaling Agile. So I think everybody agrees about the importance of portfolio management and adapting it to an Agile context. Now, despite all that agreement about the importance, and despite the fact that many people have talked about Agile portfolio management or portfolio Kanban, to my experience, to my knowledge, the current guidance and the current practice does not go much further than visualization. So a lot of the presentations that I've seen, a lot of the people that I've heard talking about real cases about portfolio management always get stuck, or always seem to get stuck at the level of visualizing the initiatives, visualizing the highest level of work in the organization, with some notion of having a conversation around that visualization, with some notion of maybe some selection, and I'll come back to that in the next slide, and then with some notion of maybe limiting the amount of initiatives in the organization, in analogy with limiting the amount of work in progress at the team level. So that's, I think, the current state of the art. Now I do think that we need to go further than this visualization. We shouldn't get stuck at the proto Kanban level. I think there's lots of value in going beyond this. It's needed, and I hope to show you why, and it's also possible. And again, I hope to show you how. So the main way of thinking about the portfolio level is so thinking about it, about flow in terms of demand and supply, or thinking about the portfolio as a demand and a supply. The current thinking is that in most cases demand tends to exceed capacity, and it tends to exceed capacity by far. As it says on the slide, it's easier to come up with an idea than it is to realize it. But supply is limited. So we have limited resources. So somehow we need to protect that supply, and so we need to select demand, and we need to select the demand that comes out most favorable, with whatever definition of most favorable that you have. So I think that's the current thinking when we talk about portfolio. There's a couple of challenges that we need to deal with when we're talking about an Agile context. One challenge is obviously uncertainty. we've discovered that it's not always clear what the customer wants. It's not always clear what the customer needs. It's maybe not always clear who the customer is. So in some cases, there's a question about economic viability. So there's an uncertainty around that. There might be an uncertainty around will the users like it? So is it desirable? There might be questions around the feasibility. Can we actually develop the product? Can we actually solve the problem? So we've by now we've learned that we need to have feedback loops and preferably short feedback loops in order to deal with that uncertainty. But certainly we've learned that there is uncertainty. There's also volatility. Demand is not always stable, and especially in a changing environment, demand fluctuates. And trying to follow the fluctuating demand with our capacity is not always feasible, nor is it optimal. So there's volatility, there is complexity, and in this presentation I'm mainly interested in complexity on the supply side. So there's many people that are involved in supplying a solution. There's many people involved in developing a product, and sometimes the supply side might be quite complex. There might be many, especially for the presentation here. We're going to focus on the fact that we have many people involved, and that they will not always have the same skills, we might have different teams with different competencies, with different capabilities, and they all need to be synchronized in order to come to a solution. So there's complexity, there's ambiguity. I talked about uncertainty. There's lots of room for interpretation. There's even ambiguity around the fact that something might be uncertain or not uncertainty. So there's lots of room. There's lots of room for interpretation. So I think all of these are the challenges that we need to cope with when we talk about agile portfolio management that go beyond the traditional thinking of portfolio management. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, I probably were also present in a more traditional environment, but they're surely very much present in the world of today. So this is the VUCA world that many people talk about. So it's not only about starting up, growing and conserving a business, but it's also taking into account the fact that there might be a disturbance or disruption, and we need to also be prepared for the back loop, for renewal or capturing of new opportunities. So when we're talking about an agile portfolio, we need to deal with that VUCA world. In doing so, we're gonna challenge the current thinking a little bit. And in the beginning of the presentation, I'm going to use systems dynamics to help you think through some of those challenges. Now, it's not my purpose to give you a crash course in systems dynamics, but I do think there's a couple of key concepts that you need to that I need to explain. So a very simple diagram here. So we've got an inflow. That inflow fills the stock, and that outflow that drains the stock. A simple example. So we've got a a population, which is the stock. The population is replenished by birds, by babies, so to speak, and that population is drained by diseases, by people that by a certain death rate. An important element of systems dynamics is reinforcing and balancing loops. So we have a reinforcing loop here. So the bigger the population, obviously, if we have more people or species or animals in our population, the bigger the population, the more babies we will have. So that will increase our birth rate. And that keeps on growing exponentially because it will increase our birth rate. When our birth rate increases, we have again more population, which again increases our birth rate. So that leads to an exponential behavior of our population. Now, luckily, so to speak, luckily, or I'm not sure, but luckily there's a balancing loop also. The bigger population, the more if you're talking about a population of people, the more people die. So that balances out the reinforcing loop, and so that leads to the balancing loop leads to a goal-seeking behavior. So if we combine the reinforcing and the balancing loop, we get an S-curve. So the stock exhibits an S-curve. The population exhibits an S-curve. So initially the exponential behavior dominates, but after a while the balancing loop will start dominating, and the curve will start flattening out. So that's the standard behavior of a system that most people are familiar with. Now, one important variation of this theme is when we have delays. Suppose that in this example, suppose that it takes a very long time before the babies are actually born. So suppose that we have a delay on the reinforcing loop. So it takes much longer than 9 months before the babies are actually born. So that would mean that at a certain point in time, the balancing loop would take over, our stock would start going down, and then we would have the babies that start to become born, so the stock goes up again, and so we start to have an oscillating behavior. So this is standard systems dynamics. Once we have delays, we start having an oscillation. If you've been in a shower where the thermostat is there is a little bit of a delay on the thermostat, you might have experienced this. So the shower is too cold. You keep on turning it up, but there's the delay. So it stays cold for a while, but then suddenly it starts getting too hot because of the delay. It gets too hot, and then you start turning it down again. So you start having an oscillating behavior of the temperature of the water. This type of systems can be found everywhere. For example, the boom and bust cycles in the economy are also a result of delays in reinforcing and balancing loops in the economy. So it's a very pervasive type of system that we can experience. So we're going to use that to go beyond the visualization. So I think WIP limits only scratch. We've only seen the tip of the iceberg with WIP limits. So WIP limits are a mechanism at the team level. When we're talking about an agile portfolio there's more than only overburdening as a challenge. We need to deal with fluctuating demand. We need to deal with heterogeneous capabilities. We need to potentially, in a multi-customer situation, deal with conflicting demand. And in a very uncertain situation, we also need to deal with demand that cannot be measured or judged by the same standards. So an incommensurable demand. So there's quite some challenges beyond overburdening that we need to tackle when we're talking about the portfolio level. And each of these challenges deserves a solution in its own. So let's apply our simple, very basic systems thinking to the team level, to the flow of work. So it's quite a it's actually the type of insight that started the Kanban community, I think. We can think about work as a flow. We have the rate of starting work. The more work we start, the more WIP, work in progress, that we get. So the WIP, the work in progress, is our stock. And then how is the work in progress depleted? It is by finishing work. Now again, we have a reinforcing loop and a balancing loop. The more work in progress we have, the more work can get blocked. The more work that can blocked, the more people that become idle. And if we don't have a system where, or a team where the flow is managed, this typically results into starting new work. Now, if left unchecked, this means that our WIP would grow exponentially. Now, that's not the type of behavior that we see in reality. In reality, there's also a balancing loop. The more WIP we have, the more chance that there is one item that we can actually finish. So, in technical terms, this means the more pull options that we have, and the more pull options that we have, the more work we can actually finish. So that's the balancing loop. It's the goal-seeking behavior. So the sum or the end result of the composition of those two is an S-curve, as we would expect from the systems dynamics, but also as we see in reality. Limiting WIP mainly results in flattening that S-curve, making that S-curve less high. So constraining the stock, and then by doing that, reducing the lead times and getting all of the goods that we have been all the good things that we have been talking about in the Kanban community. So shorter lead times, a higher throughput, and so on and so on. So that's standard Kanban thinking. That's standard flow thinking. We can represent work as a flow system. Now we can try to do the same for an end-to-end flow. And so with an end-to-end flow, I mean a flow that goes from a suspected need, a customer that comes with an idea, or a business that comes with an idea, and then elaborates on that idea in an upstream process, up to the point where we have work items that are ready to be executed in our inventory, and then we have a downstream part to actually execute the work. So from suspected to satisfied need. Two parts. The upstream part, in technical terms, is about creating the options in the inventory. In the upstream, it's still everything is still optional. So that's why we talk about options. So that creates our inventory. Oftentimes people talk about a backlog rather than inventory. So that's our backlog that we can pick work from. in the downstream to actually exercise the options, meaning that we commit and that we start turning the option into a commitment, and we execute the work. Later on, I will talk about two lead times: system Capman, the downstream, the system lead time, so the lead time from the point where we commit up to the point where the work is typically ready to be accepted by the customer. And then I will also talk about the upstream lead time, which is the time between when we start actually working or elaborating an idea, start creating the option up until the point when the option is ready to be executed. So I'll use those two lead times later on in the presentation. So before modeling this as a systems diagram, I'll expand on this a little bit. So in this end-to-end flow, we have two parts. We have a demand part and we have a supply part. The demand part is the options that are ready to be executed, and then the supply part is the capacity that is free to execute those options. So in the ideal world, we have ready options and we have the free capacity to execute those options. So in technical terms, this means that we have liquidity. So when we have the liquidity, on the one hand, we have just enough options that we can exercise, and we have just enough capacity to commit the capacity to exercise those options. With some delay, this means that we have less options ready because we've committed them the options and so they're not an option anymore; they're a commitment, and we have less free capacity. So the two O's on the arrows are O's for opposite. So the more options we exercise, the less options we have ready. The more capacity we commit, the less free capacity that we have. So that's the ideal situation. Less ideal. If we exercise our options, we might come to the point where we have too little options. Now, if we have too little options, that means that we might risk starvation downstream. So we might risk not having sufficient work anymore downstream. So that means that we need to create new options. And again, when we create options, we might so that it results in more ready options. But notice that there is a delay. So creating options costs time. Ideas need to be elaborated. We need to maybe talk with the customer or with users. There's internal hurdles that need to be jumped. So we need to pass all the selection hurdles. So creating options is not immediate. There is a delay. We might also have too little capacity. So that means that we need to release capacity into the organization in order to free up capacity. But again, there's delay. Now it's exactly those delays that are important when we model the end-to-end flow. So modeling it as a flow system is quite straightforward. We have the rate of creating options that feeds into our options inventory, and then we have the exercising of options that depletes our options inventory. Again, we have a reinforcing loop. When our inventory becomes empty, there's a lack of demand. So we have too little options. That means that we might put more emphasis on creating new options. We have a balancing loop. when we have too many options, then there's a danger of overburdening. There might be a lack of supply, so it means that maybe we start looking at ways of increasing the rate of exercising the options, or maybe on the other hand, decreasing the rate of creating new options. The big difference with flow at the work level is that, as I told you in the previous slide, there is delay. Now, delay in a system diagram means that there's oscillation. So it means that our inventory, our options inventory, starts oscillating between situations where the options inventory is very high and situations where the options inventory might become very low. So if demand was not oscillating from the start, which it typically does, because of the delays in creating options, it actually starts oscillating by itself. So we need to deal with that oscillation. So let's look at the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is a scenario where we start with an inventory of options, and then we start exercising those options. So we focus, as the Kanban guidance tells us, we focus on finishing what we started. So we focus on finishing work. And so we're so much focused on finishing work that our full focus is on exercising the options up to the point where our options inventory is empty. Now, at that point in time, we can start focusing on creating new options, but there's a delay. That delay is exactly the same as the upstream lead time. So the length of that delay is the time between elaborating an idea and an idea being ready to be exercised. So that's our upstream lead time. And then we get, after that delay, we get a new batch of work, which we can start exercising again. We can start working on again. But again, if we wait too long, up until the point where our inventory is empty, again, we get an empty inventory, we get a delay. Each time we have a delay, our downstream team is start from work, and so that means that we lose capacity. We lose capacity in the downstream team, which is something we want to avoid at all costs. So as I said, this is a worst case scenario. In reality, probably we're not going to wait until our backlog is empty. But still, if we want to make optimal use of our downstream capacity, we want to avoid at all costs that the downstream team is starved from work. So we need to prevent this situation at all costs. Now, not every team has experiences this problem, or not every organization experiences this problem at the same level. So obviously, the bigger the upstream lead time and the bigger the upstream batch size, the more this problem is experienced. Typically, organizations that work with big projects experience this problem the most. But even organizations that have a fairly agile way of working might still experience this problem where inventory becomes depleted and the downstream work team is starved from work. The solution comes from supply chain management. So rather than waiting until our inventory of options is empty, we need to start working on creating options earlier. So how much earlier? Well, exactly the amount of time that is that equals our upstream lead time. So this is the notion of an order point. So the order point is the point at which, below which, we don't want to go with our inventory. So if we go below the order point, that's the point where we need to order more options from the upstream. It's the same as in your kitchen or your in your cabinet in the kitchen. It's the point where you say, if we have less than this number of items in the closet in the closet, that's the point where we need to go to the shop and buy new things. So we start focusing on upstream. We don't wait on up until the point where we risk starvation. We start doing it earlier. Now, obviously, we want to build in some buffer. So we want to build in some buffer, and so we need to have some safety stock. So which moves our order point even a little bit further up the curve. In practice, these order points, how do they look like on a Kanban board? So suppose that we have an upstream and a downstream board here, where the downstream delivers 5 items per week, and our upstream lead time is 2 weeks. So that means that we need to have a stock of 2 weeks worth of work. So in this case, if the downstream team delivers 5 items per week, that means that we need to have a stock of 10 items. Now the dynamics of it is that if we have, let's say that we have 5 items in the ready to execute and 5 items in the ready to commit, and over the period, the delivery period of a week, the ready to execute will deplete the 5 items from the ready to execute. So that means that we need to have 5 extra items in the ready to commit. So the order point is a minimum limit. In this case, we set a minimum limit of 12 items, 10 plus 2 of safety stock, 12 items over the ready to execute and the ready to commit, in order to ensure that at all times we have items ready to be executed. So that's how we deal with fluctuating demand. So order points. There's a couple of more challenges. Let's start with continue with heterogeneous capability. So heterogeneous capability is encountered when we have multiple teams that have different competencies that are not overlapping or not compatible, or not, where people cannot take over the work of other people. Hardware, software, front end, back end, all kinds of examples can be imagined. And so what happens in that case? So in this board, we represent the work of multiple teams on one board, and so we have bigger requests, the dark bluish items that require different competencies, red, green, or black competencies. And so if you look at the active column, so the request there required two green competencies and one red competency, and since we had that capacity, we could actually start the request and everybody that was needed could actually also work together on that request. Now, oftentimes, out of resource utilization considerations, we start a request like the second one in the active column, where we need a green, red, and black competency, but the green competency is not available. So what happens? We finish the work items for red and black, but those work items get blocked because we're still waiting for the green competency to actually finish the green work item. And until that work item is finished, red and black are blocked. So that's a situation that we want to avoid at all times. In terms of work in progress, what this means is that at the team level, we see a work in progress that is quite under control. So you talk with each team, and at the work item level, all the work in progress is under control. But if you look at the cross-team level, at the request level, the requests in progress are not under control because we start requests that we cannot finish. So this is a situation that we want to avoid at all costs. So we can introduce the notion of cap tokens, representing the capacity of teams to work on requests. So cap token is a representation of the amount of requests that a team can work on at the same time. And so this means that we only start a request when we have the appropriate cap tokens of the team. And when the request is finished, the cap tokens are returned, signaling that capacity has become available to start working on a new request. In practice, this means that we're going to match our demands with our supply. So here we have a board where we have a team blue, red, and yellow, and our demands indicates on each demand, on each request, there's an indication of which capacities, which capabilities are needed. So the first item needs green and red competencies. The second item only needs blue competencies, and the third item needs red and blue competencies. And then the cap tokens in the ready to execute indicate capacity that is available that can be used to execute demand. So in this case, we can match the bottom request with that needs red and blue competency. We can match it with the available capacity of red and blue because of the fact that we have red and blue tokens available. So at the top of the downstream, we see a request that is in progress that required red and yellow competency. So the red team is all working on it, the yellow team is working on it. They can collaborate because they're working on it synchronously at the same time. So we actually facilitate the collaboration between the multiple teams. And when the teams have finished their work, when the request is finished, we actually can recycle the red and the yellow token. We can recycle the red and the yellow token, and that means that we can reuse those tokens, maybe in a different configuration with a blue one. We can recycle those tokens to start to match it with new requests. So we have a continuous matching of capacity and demand with the purpose of synchronizing the different teams so that they can work together to finish requests. Now, one of the disadvantages of this might be that we're eating up our capacity with all kinds of small and more tactical demands. So because the small and the more tactical demand don't require many multiple competencies, they quite easily match. And so that eats up our easily eats up all our capacity. Sometimes we want to reserve capacity for upcoming bigger requests that require multiple competencies, many multiple competencies. So we want to reserve capacity, so we can actually reserve capacity by moving cap tokens upstream. If we know that there's an important upcoming demand, and we want to make sure that once the demand is ready to be committed, that it actually can quickly start and that we don't have to wait until capacity frees up. So we move the cap tokens upstream to reserve the capacity. Now, obviously, that might mean that some of the downstream teams may be starved of work because we have reserved the capacity. So we're not fully utilizing the capacity of downstream teams, but that is a deliberate decision. That's a deliberate decision in order to make sure that more strategic requests flow fluently through the system. So when demand is not always coming from one customer, demand comes from multiple customers. So in this case, we have an upstream where we have 3 customers, X, Y, and Z. Now, if you look at the demand from Y and Z, the 2 last customers, there's a conflicting demand because we only have capacity for available capacity for two blue, and we actually require 3 blue items. So this is a situation where we have multiple customers. Now, what we start seeing here is the emergence of a marketplace, where we can match supply and demand, because we're actually making the capacity from the downstream side. We're making the capacity available, explicit, transparent through the cap tokens, and we're making the demand, the needs, the demand explicit through the requests. We start seeing the emergence of a marketplace where we continuously match demand and supply. The way of organizing that marketplace is up to the organization. It can be organized through an authority ranking, where one person calls the shots and determines which demand gets priority. It could be through equality matching. Each customer gets their own turn, or it can be organized through as a real market, through a market pricing mechanism, where we actually need to bid for the cap tokens. So we really see the portfolio turning into a marketplace where demand and supply is matched. So that's moving into heterogeneous capability and possible conflicting demand. The final challenge is the challenge of demand that cannot be judged by the same standards. So again, if you go back to the original thinking on the portfolio level, most of the time the original thinking is we need to compare different demands with each other in order to be able to prioritize and to select. Now, the truth of the matter is that not all demand can be compared by the same standards. So if A and B are commensurable, then they can be easily compared and ordered or prioritized. If both A and B are low uncertainty, low value items, so certain but not so high value, probably you will be able to compare them with each other. But oftentimes we have other demands that is not comparable by the same standards with a C demand in this case that is not comparable by the same standards as A can be compared to B. If you take A and B as high certainty but low value but high certainty, typically high uncertainty but potential high value cannot be compared with the same standards as low certainty, low value. So not all demands should be treated alike. In the meantime, we've discovered that not all demands, not for some demands, it's clear what the problem or opportunity is, but this is not the case for all demands. Some demands, for some demands, the problem or opportunity is unclear. So we need to organize for very short feedback loops, maybe in the form of a minimum viable product. But for some demands, the problem or opportunity might be quite clear, but it might not be clear how it impacts the solution, impact the users. It's not clear whether the solution will be desirable to users, so we need to test or experiment. And in some cases, we need to test feasibility. So not every demand is the same, and not every demand requires the same treatment, and not every demand can be compared by the same standards. Under pressure. So what happens under pressure? So demand exceeds capacity, as we stated in the beginning, and then we want to protect supply. So we need to select demands, and so that requires that we can compare the different demands, but now we're in the situation where not all demands can be compared with each other. They cannot be compared by the same standard, so we seem to be in a problematic situation. We need to, in order to protect the supply, we need to compare, but then from the demand side, not all demand can be compared. And even in cases where demand can be compared, all the hurdles that we put up to actually compare the different demands only create more delay. And as we've seen in the beginning of the presentation, the more delay that we have upstream, the more oscillation that we have. So this is quite a serious problem that needs to be tackled. We can get inspiration from outside. We can get inspiration from other places where they are very much confronted with this problem, and this we can get inspiration from field hospitals or crisis situations where clearly demand outstrips capacity very much, and not only that, demand exceeds capacity by far, but also our time pressure and also the resources that are available are not of the nature that we can spend a lot of time in setting priorities. If you talk about a field hospital, setting priorities between the different patients that come in, we don't have the resources and the time to spend a lot of time in prioritizing and selecting which patient to treat in which order. So this is dealt with triage. So how do you route patients under time pressure? By a very simple coloring scheme. So the keyword here is a simple coloring scheme. It's a scheme based on the experience of the person that does the triage. So it's not based on an elaborate framework of testing and developing a business case for every patient. No, it's based on the experience of the person that does the triage. So a typical triage system would make a distinction between expectant patients. Expectant patients are patients that are so severely injured that given our available resources, they are unlikely to survive. Immediate patients, they cannot wait, but are likely to survive if we treat them immediately. And then an important distinction, the distinction between observation and ambulant patients. Observation patients are patients that are might be stable for the moment, but if we don't start observing them, maybe even start diagnosing them, we might risk becoming too late. Might risk to come too late that while they might be stable at this point in time, they might the situation might the patient might the situation of this patient might escalate, and the patient might become an immediate patient. So we want to avoid that. So we start observing and maybe already diagnosing the patient in order to avoid escalation into an immediate situation. So that's the observation, the yellow patient. The green patient is an ambulant patient. So the ambulant patient is stable, and we don't suspect any change in the situation of the patient. So this is the walking wounded. It's the patient that is sent back to the waiting room. They will be treated, but they will be treated when it's practical for us, for the hospital. Now, oftentimes people think that triage is just another prioritization mechanism. It's not. It's not just prioritization. It's more than prioritization. It's classification and also routing. So here you see a photo of an actual situation in a hospital, and if you notice, you see the colored lines on the floor, and they are an indication of based on the triage, we're going to route the situation to a different place in the hospital. For example, when it's red, the patient immediately goes into an ER room, and we don't bring the patient to the machinery to diagnose or to treat, but we bring the machinery to diagnose and to treat towards the patient. So it's a all hands on deck situation. So it's an immediate treatment. While, for example, the green line might guide the patient back to the waiting room, and the yellow line might guide the patient towards an observation or a diagnosis part of the hospital. So it's more than prioritization; it's actually classification and routing. We can apply the same principles to demands in a knowledge work environment. So we don't have patients, but different requests. So the black request is a request that where we question the validity of the demand. So this is a request that needs to be escalated maybe to to a higher level of management or to an advisory board needs to be escalated for decision making because we doubt the validity of the demands. Expedite. It's like the immediate patient. It's all hands on deck. The demand needs immediate action. So it becomes an expedite as we know it in a Kanban system. So if needed, we break all the WIP limits and everybody swarms on the request. It's a crisis situation. Preempt. So this is the type of demand. The customer has a demand and issues the demand, issues the request. And we, as a team, we suspect that if we're not careful, the demand might escalate or expedite. So we want to avoid expediting. We suspect that it's an important demand for the customer, but there might be a certain risk involved. There might be a certain complexity involved. So rather than waiting for the customer, if we ask a question, rather than waiting for the customer to answer back, we start becoming very proactive. We try to keep ahead of events. So we, rather than waiting for the customer, we actually go to the customer. We start analyzing, we start examining the demand because we suspect that there's a risk to the demand. We suspect that if we're not proactive, the demand might become problematic or might expedite. So that's the preempt demand, and then we have pull demand. So this is demand where we don't suspect that it might escalate into a problem. So we treat it when it's practical for us, when capacity allows. We might reserve a certain capacity for the pull demand, but if needed, that capacity might become occupied by preempt demand. So pull demand we treat when it's practical for us. Triage is also routing in a knowledge work environment. So we talked about the different steps that ideally a demand goes through. So ideally a demand goes through a discovery step where we find out what the problem is or the opportunity. Then we design a solution and then we develop. So ideally all demand goes through all those steps. Reality is that often demand comes in not as a problem, but demand comes in as a partial solution. The customer might be aware of the problem that they try to solve, but at least is not explicitly communicating that, is communicating the solution, or in many cases the customer jumps to the solution and is not even very explicitly aware of what problem he or she is trying to solve. So while ideally all demand goes through all the steps, the reality is that in many cases demand comes in as a detailed request, typically describe a detailed solution. So triage in this case boils down to routing. It boils down to routing in terms of if a request comes in and it describes a certain solution, the question is, do we challenge that demand? Do we take the long route? Do we challenge the customer and ask, whether that solution, what is the problem that solution tries to solve, or do we leave the demand unchallenged? Do we leave the demand unchallenged? I'm sorry. So triage is a form of routing here. We cannot challenge all demand, so sometimes we need to leave demand unchallenged. We suspect that the solution, the demand, is not going to become a risk or something that escalates. So in that case, we leave the demand unchallenged. Or if, as a team, we think that the demand may become a problem, may become has a certain risk in it, and that means that we might need to challenge the demands before we actually start executing. So practically, if we put it all together, this turns into the upstream part of the portfolio Kanban. So we see the different steps: capture, discover, maybe some approval step, some design in terms of synthesis and analysis, and then the requests are ready to commit. At the level of capture, we do triage. Triage in terms of demand that actually needs to go through a discovery phase before we can go into a design phase, or demands the bottom part of the board, the demand that is classified as pull demands, the green label, which we say it goes through the short route. We immediately go to design, but not only that, we will only start treating that demand when it's practical for us. So we see the triage. We see the reserved capacity. So cap tokens that are moved upstream to reserve capacity for an important upcoming request. We see order points. So in this case, order points on the ready to commit. In practice, probably this will be order points on the combination of the ready to commit and the input queue of the downstream Kanban board. We might also see at the top of the board, we might also see minimal options, because discovery and approval take time upstream. We might and are very much dependent on external dependencies, stakeholders, customers, so people that where we don't have a lot of control of over their availability. So we might have a sort of a constraint of a set of minimal options that we want to be treating at all times, in order to make sure that we keep our pipeline, our upstream pipeline, filled at all times. So when we're talking about flow, balance in the Agile portfolio management, so on the capability side, we need to improve our delivery capability in order to better meet a demand. More than that, we know that demand is fluctuating, so we need to be prepared for a fluctuating demand. for example, by increasing the liquidity in teams so that they can better adapt to changes in the fluctuation in the demand. But there's a limit to that. There's a limit to how well a team can or an organization on the supply side can adapt to fluctuation in demand. So we also need to, on the demand side, we need to create and share the demand. We need to create and share the demand in order to make better use of a constraint capability on the supply side. In order to do that, we need to. There's a whole set of techniques that we can use. So we shouldn't be limited to WIP limits. It's not only overburdening that is a challenge. We also need to be dealing with fluctuating demand. Order points are a way of dealing with that. Heterogeneous capability, so we can deal with that through capacity tokens. Conflicting demands, so organizing a marketplace, and then demand that cannot be just judged by the same standards, and so triage is a technique that we can use in order to deal with that challenge. Portfolio management is actually the combination of all those techniques. Not necessarily always all of them. Maybe you don't have all of these challenges, but at least a serious number of them. The representation here is might be a little bit misleading. It gives the impression that it's some kind of ladder or something, and there's an increasing level of they build on each other or something. It's not the case. Oftentimes triage, it's not. Oftentimes triage is a good starting point, even in quite simple upstream Kanban situations. So often a good starting point is order points and triage together for starting with an upstream Kanban token, and then moving in the portfolio level, we add cap tokens and the notion of this marketplace. So there's not necessarily an order in which things proceed. So that kind of I think finishes what I wanted to say. I think we need to go beyond visualization. We need to tackle the VUCA challenges. We need to tackle fluctuation, complexity, uncertainty. We need to tackle them, and also we need to tackle them at the portfolio level. So with that, I think I want to hand over back to Mahesh.
Wonderful.
Maybe there's
wonderful presentation, Patrick. I think that was really content-rich, knowledge-rich presentation. Probably one of the best that I have attended overall, and certainly from you as well. Thank you for that. I know we are over the time quite a bit, but obviously a lot of people have stayed back. In fact, I would say most of the people have stayed back to hear you on the complete presentation. So thank you for everyone for that. Let's quickly take a few questions and see if we can do justice to them in the time that we have. Let's not take a lot of time. Let's take the first one, and this is related to the thought that I myself was having, that the challenge, one of the biggest challenges with demand and capacity is that both can be complex in nature, that the demand can be multifaceted in terms of the nature of the work, the mix of the work, etc. And on the other side, you have capacity also in multiple units and multiple types of work that needs to be done or can be done. So related to that, there's a question that should a cap token, in typical situation perhaps, should a cap token equal a person, a team, or should it be seen as a WIP limit on a team level? For example, maximum number of concurrent requests for a specific team. What are some of the ways that you've seen these cap tokens actually designed or in use in real situations?
So cap tokens represent the capacity of the teams in terms of WIP. Very explicitly so. So in the example, the cap tokens represent the capacity of the team in terms of how many requests they can handle at the same time. So it's a higher level of limit. It's not at the work item level. It's more of a limit at the request level. So it's a representation for each team how many requests that each team can deal with at the same time. I inspired myself on a technique out of quick response manufacturing, where they employ a system that is called Polka. The difference between quick response manufacturing and a typical lean manufacturing is that in a lean manufacturing we have a quite a linear production system and a quite one-size-fits-all production system. In quick response manufacturing is targeted at jobs where each job might go through a different route through the shop, right? Through the production system.
Right.
And so the cap tokens were inspired by that. If you have different jobs going in through different routes, you want to limit the amount of jobs in progress. And so when you start a job, you want to make sure that all the machines that are needed by that job are available to actually finish the job. So that's kind of the starting point for the cap tokens.
Right.
So there's very much in the spirit of Kanban. So we represent capacity by WIP, not by number of persons.
Right. Right. In fact, in Swift Kanban, I should just mention this, and it probably responds to some of the other supplementary questions around this, that you can define WIP limits in terms of either the number of cards, number of items that a person can work on, or it could be in some total of another unit of measure, such as story points or hours. And I think different teams can perhaps define cap tokens in different ways. But there are a couple of follow-up questions in that sense, that what is the relation between capacity and velocity from a Scrum point of view? Are they the same concept? And another question, that is cap token equal to story points in Agile Scrum? And I guess the answer is yes. It is in terms of the WIP limit that you can define for the team, right?
Yeah. So the cap tokens are I would hesitate a little bit in terms of basing them on story points, especially if you're looking at the portfolio level. You really want to base them at a high enough level. So maybe you want to have your cap tokens represents the number of requests that a team can work on at the same time. Now that being said, that makes an assumption that requests are there might be some variability in the size of requests, but that variability shouldn't exceed maybe one order of magnitude. So if you have two orders of magnitude of difference in size of requests, you will need to base your cap tokens then on on something that breaks down requests in something that is a little bit more uniform. And so that resembles then a little bit more the type of thing that you would do with story points. So it does depend on a breakdown of requests that or in requests they might be variable in size but not too variable in size.
Right. The other aspect of challenges that one sees in portfolio management in a typical business scenario is that while a triage situation in a hospital emergency system might have a more consistent view of the condition or the situation of a patient that's walking in the case of a typical portfolio management scenario, there are conflicting views of what is considered critical by one set of stakeholders versus the other. So if there is that conflict to begin with, how do you deal with that? That is one thing. And how do you sort of get everybody on the same page? The other aspect is that as time passes, there might be change in the situation. And so therefore, you did talk about retriaging, but I suppose that's the only way to make sure that you're assessing the demand correctly, that you poll frequently to see that the demand is of the right categorization, right classification.
Yeah, indeed. So the triage is not so triage is not prioritization. So it's not an assessment of how to what extent something is more prior than something else. That's what makes it really different from prioritization. So the triage is done by the supply side. So it's done by where the demand lands. It's done by the supply side, and it's mainly done on the basis of so on the one hand, would this escalate in terms of would this become time critical? Do we think that this will become time critical at a certain point in time? And might become explodes into something big and ugly. So it's more based on an assessment of will this become a problem rather than a prioritization. That being said, this means that within the different triage values, we still need to to prioritize our demands, but then within each class of triage. So within the class of pull demands, the green color, this means that we might still have some prioritization within that triage value.
Correct. Yeah, makes sense. All right. So I'm going to actually have to stop here. There are a few more questions that we will probably need to leave unanswered, and perhaps we can do a follow-up with the people whose questions remain unanswered on email. Patrick, I'll share all the questions with you, and of course, we will get back to all of you whose questions we didn't take up. Patrick, I wanted to thank you once again for firstly such a rich presentation. And also, given your condition, I was feeling quite bad that we were, having this presentation when you're not feeling too good. Thank you so much for that, and wonderful.
Yeah, it's no problem. I prefer to have the presentation. It's no problem.
Wonderful.
Always happy to present this type of stuff.
Absolutely. Likewise.
I'm very happy to answer the questions through email.
Yes. So we will take that up. I will send you the questions, and of course, we'll have a chance to interact with the people who are on the webinar today. To all the folks who have stayed back, more than half the people are still here. Sincere thanks to all of you for staying back in this stretch session. And I think all of us had a tremendous opportunity to learn based on Patrick's presentation and his experience, and of course a new set of tools to apply back to our challenges of agile portfolio management. So thank you all for staying back, and I hope that you will join us in a future webinar again. We will follow up this with an email and send you the links to the recording of the webinar. And of course, you're very welcome to connect with us on email with any follow-up questions that you might have on the topic that we covered today. Patrick, thank you so much, and look forward to interacting with you, in the future again.
Cool.
All right, get well soon. That's what a lot of people are saying on
Thank you.
On the webinar as well.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks a lot, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.